So I was inspired by the Bourbon Jerk in his video 5 Distilleries He Avoids in 2024, so I figured I have strong opinions. Why don't I make my own list of that? Stay tuned after the break and we'll talk about it. So if you're not familiar, the Bourbon Jerk is another whiskey tube content creator, and his set is beautiful. If you want to check him out, the video that I'm referring to is right here. Go give that a watch, either before or after you watch mine. Doesn't matter. The idea is the 5 distilleries that we avoid, right? He has some pretty good points in his. So these aren't necessarily whiskeys that I dislike for taste, and there's definitely going to be people who disagree with me on a lot of these, honestly. Some of these are for taste, some of these are for price, and some of them are just because they're doing some shady stuff in their distillery. So we're going to kind of talk about that, and I'm going to give you the reasons why I avoid all of these distilleries. So number 5 is going to be an unpopular one. I can already see the comments, and that is Penelope. So Penelope recently was bought by MGP. So they've been sourcing MGP, as far as I know, since they've begun. So they started getting big in about 2019 when I started caring about bourbon. And I remember their first one was a rosé cask finish, and they had another just like 80 proof bourbon. And they've expanded greatly since then. And I understand they are easy to find. They are generally pretty much on the cheap side. I know their main, at least in my opinion, competitor is Nulu, who is also doing a lot of similar stuff and sourcing from MGP at the same time. Where I differ on those is actually pretty much the reason why I avoid Penelope altogether. And that is Penelope's stuff has always tasted really young to me. Their whiskey tastes like they're taking young, immature whiskey and finishing it to kind of curb those notes and make it passable. If I want finished whiskey, I want a whiskey that is good on its own, that then they have finished and made it better somehow. And I've had many, many bottles of Penelope. I do enjoy some of it. I had a barrel strength that I enjoyed, but the more and more Penelope got to be bigger, the more and more it tasted like they were taking young whiskey and making it not great. Now, the Nulu comparison, right? There's a lot of Nulu comparison bottles to ones that Penelope are also putting out, but the Nulu ones, in my opinion, even the younger ones, don't have a lot of those young whiskey, grainy corn, candy corn, whatever flavors that I attribute to being young whiskey. A lot of them, even if they're 4 or 5 years old, don't have that. So I don't know if they're finishing for a longer amount of time and that is rounding that out. I don't know what they're doing. I know that they're much more expensive, right? I don't generally buy Nulu anymore because the prices jumped from 80, 90 bucks for pretty good whiskey to 100, 120, even 150 in the case of the honey. But Penelope, I have still, even their 9-year, I was not crazy about it. And part of that is that I don't like 4-grain whiskey. For whatever reason, I always find it tastes like popcorn. It is not my cup of tea, and I'm not saying that it's all bad or anything like that. It just generally tastes young to me, or it's not up my alley. So continuing on in my cult favorites that I hate, Whistle Pig Distillery out of Vermont. They are famous for their rise, I would say. They've definitely been rising in the bourbon industry too. They're actually distilling their own bourbon. They've done a bunch of Canadian whiskey. A lot of their whiskey actually is Canadian rye. And my biggest gripe with them is that their stuff feels too expensive for what it is. So they have a 15-year that is $250. That just feels way more expensive than it needs to be. There's other 15-year ryes on the market, especially 15-year Canadian ryes. Their whiskey does taste good. I will give them that. But $250 for a 15-year age-stated Canadian rye whiskey at 90 proof just feels too expensive. Now, there are exceptions. There's one really big one for me, and that is the Whistle Pig F1 collaboration with Alfa Romeo. I think that is now all gone, which is sad to see. I will be savoring the last of my bottle of it. It is very good. Some of their whiskey is very good, and that one I think was 50 bucks. Well worth the price. Their piggybacks, I think, are closer, although the bourbon and the regular 6-year rye were not my cup of tea. They're less expensive, and that I feel better about doing. It's just, it seems like their core lineup is way more expensive than it needs to be. All right, so next one on my list is Four Roses, and this is going to be a spicy take because I know there are a lot of people that love Four Roses. Their stuff is generally pretty available except for the absolute top end. offerings and they have 10 recipes. So in theory, there is something for everyone to like. Now, I think where I differ is the fact that both of their offerings are high rye. So they run a 21% rye mash bill and a 36% rye mash bill. That to me is too much rye. So there are very few exceptions for me liking anything at 20% above, and Green River is really the only one off the top of my head for a whole distillery that I like. Even low rye MGP stuff is generally too rye spicy for me. The higher rye ones tend to be overly rye spice or baking spices or that kind of stuff, and that's why I don't tend to like high rye mash bills. Now, they are introducing 2 new mash bills, and they will either then have 12 recipes or they'll have 20 if they decide to use all 5 of their yeast strains on both of those mash bills. They can expand to 20. I don't think there's been any other information for that other than the email that they dropped for their Four Roses Insiders that they were doing 2 separate mash bills. So there is going to be a lower rye percentage mash bill at 85% corn, 10% rye, 5% malted barley, and that might be much more up my alley. I know I have all 10 of the recipes that I need to do at some point. I need to just bite the bullet and see if there is a recipe that I like. All of their products to me tend to be overly herbal or too much baking spices. The only exception to that so far has been the 135th edition, but Four Roses as a whole, just kind of, it is not for me. That's honestly what it is. I'm not judging anybody who likes Four Roses. Their profile is just not for me. That's all it is. All right, coming down to the wire. The next one on the list is Angel's Envy. And if you know me or have watched my content for any amount of time, that's not surprising to you. The standard offering is $55 for an 86.6 proof bourbon, and that feels like too much to me. I know it is a premium experience and a lot of people really love it. It is a cult classic, cult favorite, great whiskey for beginners. Their cask strength is pretty good. The problem being that it's like $275. In addition, they have a new cask strength rye out. That's also great, but it's expensive. Almost all of their stuff feels 30 to 50% more expensive than it needs to be to a similar product. The single barrels, I think, are probably the closest to a value in their entire lineup. And some of them are really good, but all in all, their stuff just feels too expensive. If the cask strength was $150, I think it would be appropriately priced. It just feels like too much money. It is definitely tasty, but in that range, it is not worth spending money on when there's other things that are as good or better to me that are less expensive. So that is why I avoid Angel's Envy. If their prices ever do come down, I think they will be more on my radar. But as of right now, I'm pretty much avoiding anything from their distillery because of price. And finally, the distillery that I avoid the most is the Good Times Distillery. Now, part of it is, as I said, shady practices, because there's a lot of whiskey that they have that's like Mexican vanilla or blueberry pie cobbler, or insert whatever crazy finish they're doing here. I know I've seen a ton of them. There's pretty much infinite number of them out there, and it seems like they are cranking out single barrels like you would not believe. Part of it is I've had some Good Time stuff. I have a toasted cigar blend, and tastes artificial to me. And the internet has been in an uproar to them about specifically what is happening with their barrel picking program. There have been allegations that they are not actually emptying their barrels before they start the finishing process. They are not taking all of the liquid of whatever wine or whatever anything else is out of it. It is then flavoring that whiskey and can no longer be called bourbon. Don't know why the TTB has not gotten involved. If they are truly doing that, I would imagine that that is a huge TTB violation and probably a lot of fines. There's a lot of really unregulated stuff in the whiskey industry, and for a term as protected as bourbon is, it is surprising that the government has not gotten more involved like they have in certain other areas, like raw dairy, for instance. It just seems like they're doing a lot of really shady stuff. They've been accused of using barrels from a company that seemingly pre-flavors barrels, which seems like a cheat code at best or a violation at worst. I really do think that Good Times is doing some crazy stuff with their barrels. And look, if that's your thing, awesome. I'm not against flavored whiskey, but I want you to call it flavored whiskey. Do not call it bourbon. Do not have it be the sanctity of what bourbon is supposed to be, and then be doing shady practices. There's 1,000 different companies out there making flavored whiskey. If that's what you're doing, own up to it and make it. I definitely don't prefer anything that I've had from Good Times. It's just not my cup of tea, and it definitely, a lot of it tastes artificial. If you like it, that's great. I'm not going to judge you for any of your purchases. But for me, I'm not spending any more of my money on Good Times until they're at least a little bit more transparent about how they do things. So that's the 5 distilleries that I avoid for multiple reasons. And I'm sure you guys have things to say. Please drop them in the comments, whether it be questioning my palate for not liking Penelope, or if it's distilleries that you avoid. I know that there's a ton of distilleries out there. Not everything is everyone's cup of tea. So tell me which distilleries you avoid and why in the comments. So we've got some upcoming things. The Fantasy Whiskey Draft had to be postponed, so stay on the lookout for that. It is always a fun time. We will make sure to promote that. I am in Kentucky for Bourbon Fest this week, so be sure to follow my Instagram or here on YouTube for some shorts. I'm sure I'll be posting some content and maybe some pictures, stuff like that. So be sure to check here and on Instagram. Link to the Instagram is at the bottom of the description for this video where it says Linktree. You can find all of my social media there. If you like this content, check out our other videos. Please like and comment on this video and subscribe if you haven't already. It helps us out a ton, and we hope you'll join us in drinking like a gentleman. Cheers. Even I would take the 2XO 13th colony. Sorry. Whoa.